majority of those who are behind this problem reside in the United States and in countries like Saudi Arabia and throughout Europe.
Of course, they're each other's allies. One supports the other, so to speak. Again, I'd like to remind the viewers, conference@presstv.com. That's our address if you want to send any comments, questions. Please do so. As promised, we are going to discuss this also with the youths. We have youths inside our studio. We're going to get to you in a moment. But first, let's go to London and find out from the youths there if they have any questions for some of our guests. And I'm going to pass it on. I can see you guys there. Do you have any questions? Feel free to ask our panel. There's three guests that we have inside the studio. We have Dr. Marandi, and of course, Abdul Ali Musa, and Kevin Barrett is also with us. First, we have to go to London, and then I'll get to you guys. Just be patient with us on that. Okay, so go ahead. Any questions that anybody has from London? Go ahead.
Any questions that anybody has from London? Go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The first question I just wanted to ask you is, where do you see the current events going within the next 10 years if they carry on going at the same speed?
And when you say current events, you mean?
I mean in terms of the Islamophobia that's happening here in the West and also in the Middle East and in terms of the extremism.
Okay, Dr. Barrett, you go ahead with that one. Kevin Barrett? Okay, let's go to Abdul Ali Musa. If you had that question, go ahead with an answer. And if not, yeah, that's okay. We're going to get them in a minute. Why don't you go ahead, Dr. Marandi?
It's very difficult to say what's going to happen 10 years from now, because it's very difficult often to gauge what's going to happen in the next few weeks. But so I'll be very careful not to make any huge predictions. But I think it largely depends on Western governments and how they conduct themselves. And I think this is becoming a major threat to their own security, because on the one hand, it is without a doubt that the West is in relative decline, and that the economic situation, for example, in Europe, North America as well, the middle class is collapsing. This is something that they themselves acknowledge. But in Western Europe and in Europe, the economic situation is on the decline. And people, as we see in Greece and in Cyprus, in Italy, in Spain, Portugal, and to a degree in France, we see life is becoming more difficult. And as a result, extremist groups are on the rise, especially right-wing, semi-fascist, fascist organizations. And I find this to be very dangerous, because on the one hand, if the United States and its European partners continue to allow extremist organizations like Daesh, like Jabhat al-Nusra, and the ideology behind it, like the Wahhabism that Saudi Arabia promotes, if they allow this to continue to grow, this is going to create, it's going to be a very serious situation where you have, for example, right-wing groups in countries like France, and then you have militant Daesh-like or Wahhabi-like organizations in the same cities, in the same country. I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Okay, I got to jump in here real quick and ask you this, because I think this is a point that needs to, if you can, elaborate more on, because again, relating to the letter being addressed to the youth, the term youth, for me anyways, means a time where there's a transition, thoughts are being nourished, are being developed, and if Europe, or economically speaking, if Europe, and we can also say the United States in some respects, if they're economically on the decline, then that means that, youth are more susceptible, especially if they're unemployed.
That's right.
For them to be taken advantage of, which is why I think that that's been one of the success factors for these Daesh terrorists, taking advantage of that situation. I think that's maybe part of what you were,
yes, exactly.
Part of what you were saying.
Right. And also right-wing fascist, semi-fascist organizations. Remember, one of the bloodiest attack in Europe was actually carried out by Christian Zionists, killing, I think, 68, 78 people in Europe, so which was quite recent. So it's not simply Daesh or Wahhabi extremism. It's extremism of all sorts. And the real danger is when young people who do not have jobs or who are susceptible to propaganda, and the media outlets constantly demonizing Muslims, and other outlets constantly demonizing those who are not Wahhabi, this otherization on all sides. This is a extremely dangerous. This can create a very dangerous situation. I think it already is. But again, I think one has to take into account that while some may say why blame Western countries, but the fact is that, for example, what we now see in this region, regardless of the fact that countries like Saudi Arabia have been investing, and other oil-rich Arab dictatorships have been investing in Wahhabism for quite a long time, for decades now, in Afghanistan and so on. But in recent years, what we saw in Libya was that NATO cooperated with Al-Qaeda. This is something that people in the West don't know. Many people, at least, many young people, that people like, and this is in the media, this is out there for people to see, people like Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who was a senior Al-Qaeda figure. NATO cooperated with him through the Qataris and other Arab regimes, and he helped to overthrow Gaddafi. He then went to a NATO country, Turkey, to Istanbul, and he led and he gave them funding as well as volunteers. So Al-Qaeda was working in Libya then with NATO cooperation in Syria. So, and this is amazing because a little over a decade ago, it was Al-Qaeda that was behind the attacks in New York. Who would have thought a little over a decade ago that the United States would at some point be having some sort of cooperation, which is out in the open. You can use a search engine to find information about this.
Right.
And so the destruction, and this is, they like to say this is sectarian, this is Muslim against Muslim, Shia is Sunni, but in reality, if you look, in Libya, there is no Iranian involvement, there are no Shias, it's a Sunni country, but NATO succeeded in destroying it by allowing extremists to have a foothold in that country. They did the same thing in Syria. For years, in the West, actually, they made documentaries about how Muslims were going to Syria to fight for freedom and so on. Now they're making documentaries demonizing those same Muslim youths that they were encouraging a couple of years ago to go.